Character is an excuse for a bad lens. That was the original title of this video, but I've kind of changed my mind. Now, I do believe that words like character and vintage are often used to describe lenses that are just kind of poor quality optically, but that's not inherently a bad thing, and it's not all the time. But one of the big decisions that a cinematographer will make for a project is the lenses that'll be used, and sometimes you want certain qualities that can aid the story in a variety of ways. Apart from the basic stuff like focal length and aperture, there's a handful of other characteristics that we would look for when we're talking about character, and that would include things like chromatic aberration, focus breathing, color reproduction, contrast, flaring, sharpness, distortion, and the characteristics of the bokeh. And in general, most of these characteristics will be more prominent when the aperture is wide open, but most lenses will clean up if you stop it down by 1 to 2 stops. But let's just go into each of them so we know what we're talking about. Chromatic aberration, most commonly longitudinal chromatic aberration, is when you have colored fringing both in front of and behind the plane of focus. Usually it'll be green in one direction and magenta in the other, and the lens that I've used that shows it the most is the 85mm 1.8 from Sony, and I made a whole video about this, so like if you're interested, go check that out after this. But it has the most obvious loci on any lens that I've used. Now, I personally don't like chromatic aberration like at all, but some people might be after that sort of effect, and this is different from halation that is pretty common on like film, and a lot of people add it in post because it kind of looks filmic, but it is different to chromatic aberration. Lens flares occur when you have a direct light source hitting the front element of the lens, and this can be a feature that a lot of people want for a lot of situations. A lot of modern photo lenses like this have very well controlled flaring, so there's not going to be a whole lot of character when it comes to that, and more vintage lenses can flare quite a lot. One issue with flaring is the artifacts that it introduces, like right here. That can be often what you're going for, but if you don't want it, then it's obviously going to be an issue. The other issue is, as you can sort of tell when I shine the light here, it also decreases the contrast a little bit, and this lens is actually not too bad with it, but cheaper lenses will drastically decrease their contrast when they get hit by a harsh light source. And how that happens is basically the shadows just get lifted a whole lot when that light source hits the element. Sometimes you may want this, but I feel like compared to the actual flaring itself, this is not a feature of a lens that you really be looking for most of the time. Probably one of the most recognizable types of flares is the blue horizontal flares caused by anamorphic lenses, and is basically a staple of classic sci-fi movies to have that horizontal blue flare caused by those anamorphic lenses. These days in modern lenses, there's more of a choice when it comes to the color of that flaring. Usually it'll be blue, amber, or silver, or neutral. Neutral would take on the color of the light itself. So if you had a really warm light, the flare would be warm. If you had a blue light, the flare would be blue. But they can add a lot to an image, but they can also be quite distracting if that's not what you're going for. Speaking of anamorphic lenses, those are the ones that squeeze the wider field of view into a smaller area of the sensor, and then you de-squeeze that in post to give us a much wider aspect ratio, the one that we're used to seeing in movies. One byproduct of this squeezing is how the out of focus regions look. They generally create a more oval shaped bokeh rather than the round, bokeh balls like back there that we see on spherical lenses. And this can also create a cool effect when you're racking focus, because the different regions of the image will be squeezed slightly differently, so it's sort of like a one-dimensional focus breathing type thing. Another thing that's common with anamorphic lenses is the difference in sharpness between the center and the edges of the frame. This is also the case with a lot of cheaper or vintage spherical lenses, but basically it's the case where the center will be sharp and then the edges will be way less sharp or even a little bit blurry, even in the same plane. On this lens, it's pretty good. So like if I'm here, I'm sharp here, and I'm still over there, as long as I stay in the same focus plane. Whereas some lenses, especially anamorphics, if you move to the side, it'll get a lot softer. This effect can be used to enhance the story because it sort of forces you to focus on what's in the center of the frame. And this is something that Greg Fraser did in The Batman a lot, where you had a bunch of people in the same plane, but only that person in the middle was really in focus. There's also a lot of cases where that might not be the case. You may want everything in the frame to be seen equally as clearly, or maybe you don't want the audience to focus in on one specific subject. Some lenses really like to let you know what is and isn't in focus through their bokeh characteristics. This goes for anamorphic lenses, but I think the most well-known case of this would be Helios lenses. These lenses can have sort of a swirly bokeh effect, which can give the image a bit of an otherworldly or dreamlike feel, which is often what they get used for, like some of the vision sequences in Dune Part 2, for example. It can also just look really cool if you're going for a really interesting looking background. Distortion is another characteristic that different lenses will show to different degrees. Generally, wider lenses will have some degree of barrel distortion, which is where the edges sort of seem stretched a bit, and the center seems a little bit further away than the edges do. And longer lenses often have pincushion distortion, which is the opposite. Very well-made lenses can have very little distortion or control it really well themselves, or some cameras will have built-in distortion compensation, kind of like how Lightroom does. If it's not controlled very well on a wide-angle lens, for example, you can get a fisheye look, which will have some rounding at the edges, and straight lines just kind of won't look straight, which could be a look you're going for in certain situations. And finally, we have contrast and color rendition. Basically, some lenses will have a little bit of a color cast to them or do better with some colors versus others. And some lenses may also deal with contrast better than others. For example, the Nisi Athena that I'm shooting on right now, they advertise those to have very good micro contrast, which is supposed to make colors feel a little bit more present and especially roll off better. Having good highlight and shadow roll off as well can make a lens just look better. Okay, so that's what character is. Now let's talk about the benefits of clean lenses. Clean lenses, while they may lack character, are generally a little bit more versatile because you don't always want a bunch of character. Sometimes you just want a nice, sharp, accurate image. Or if you do want a little bit of something else, you can augment that image in a few different ways. You can add filtration, like some sort of diffusion filter, like I have on right now. It's the 1/4 black mist from Nisi. And that just sort of takes the edge off a little bit, gives a bit of bloom to the highlights, for example, and just gives a slightly softer look. There's streak filters, like if you want to add like a fake anamorphic flare, you can do that. You can also add these things and a lot more in post. Apart from the diffusion that I have on there right now, everything else I've added has been in post. DaVinci Resolve has a bunch of built-in effects to add all kinds of stuff, and I'm sure there's even more external plugins to add anything else you'd want. Also with color, that's what grading's for. So when it comes to clean lenses, my thinking is ideally to have a set of nice clean lenses like the Nisi Athenas or the IRIX Cine Primes, and then you have the option to keep it clean or add character using filters or effects in post. And then maybe get some other lenses with a little bit more character for some more specific creative uses. And before I end the video, I just want to mention what I would look for when it comes to character in a lens. And obviously it's very dependent on the story, but the main things would be bokeh characteristics like Helios or anamorphics, or even ARRI impression filters. I think that's a great idea actually, especially since ARRI signature primes are so clean. It's nice that you have the option to change the characteristics of the bokeh, and even so much that you can make the foreground and background have different characteristics. If you haven't heard of them before, I suggest you just look it up just to know about it, because I think it's a really cool idea. And the other main thing I would look for when it comes to character is flares, if you're going for a very flare heavy look or you want specific types of flares in certain shots. You can obviously control flares with matte boxes and stuff like that, and you can add them in post, but I think in general with stuff like that, it's always better to do it in camera. So yeah, let me know your thoughts on lens character. I recently changed my mind about it a little bit, so I'm actually curious to see what other people's thoughts are on this sort of stuff. While you're in the comments, do the other things, and maybe go watch my review of the Nisi Athena 50mm over there, and I'll see you next time. Okay, bye.